We have talked about a few men of African descent already, including York, James Beckwourth, and Hiram Young. These three made substantial contributions to the American West, but there were many others, known and unknown, who did so as well. African Americans ventured into Oregon as early as the 1840s, but the California Gold Rush was the first big stimulus for free blacks to move to the West. Between 1850 and 1860, 4,000 blacks reached California. 2,000 settled in San Francisco and Sacramento, creating the first English-speaking black urban communities in the West. Mifflin W. Gibbs moved from Philadelphia to San Francisco in 1850 with only 60 cents in his pocket. After working as a bootblack, he and a partner opened a shoe store that became highly successful. In 1902, he wrote an autobiography called Shadow and Light. In 1850, miner Peter Brown wrote home to his wife in Missouri, "California is the best place for black folks on the globe. All a man has to do is work and he will make money." The abolition of slavery resulted in a mass migration of African Americans to the West. Some came on trains or steamboats. The vast majority walked to Texas, Indian Territory, and Kansas. In Texas, agricultural workers were paid $20 a month, double their pay in Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. From 1750 to 1900, the black population of Texas increased from 253,000 to over 620,000. Between 1870 and 1890, 30,000 black migrants settled in Kansas. Many former slaves took advantage of the 1862 Homestead Act to claim land in Kansas and other western states and territories. Benjamin Pap Singleton led one of these migrations from the South to Kansas. In 1874, he distributed a circular, "The Advantage of Living in a Free State," encouraging migration to Kansas. At least 10,000 African Americans traveled to Kansas between 1874 and 1890 in response to his call. In 1877, a white developer and 6 black homesteaders from the South founded the town of Nicodemus. In July, 30 colonists arrived from Kentucky. They were joined the following spring by 150 men and women from Tennessee, Missouri, and Mississippi. They were not prepared for life on the flat, windswept high plains. Williana Hickman recalled, "The scenery was not at all inviting, and I began to cry." Despite their initial misgivings, Hickman and most of the early colonists stayed on. By 1880, 258 blacks and 58 whites resided in the town and the surrounding area. But the town's prospects were always precarious, and in the 1880s, Nicodemus underwent a steady decline. The winter blizzards of 1885 destroyed 40% of the wheat crop, and the settlers began to leave. In 1887, the Missouri Pacific Railroad bypassed the town, and Nicodemus's fate was sealed. After 1888, local boosters ceased trying to attract new settlers, and prominent citizens left the area. Oliver Toussaint, known as O.T. Jackson, had been born in Ohio, but by 1910 he had been a resident of Denver for 25 years. It was in 1910 that he made the last major attempt at a black agricultural colonization on the High Plains. Jackson and his wife Minerva filed a desert claim for 320 acres in Weld County, and the town of Deerfield was born. Within 5 years, the colonists had claimed 8,000 of the county's 20,000 available acres. Deerfield's population peaked at 700 in 1921. However, the lack of water for irrigation and the post-World War II depression led to the colony's demise. Deerfield, like Nicodemus and other black towns, slid into oblivion. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, and eventually left his owner, George Reeves, to live among the Cherokee and Seminole Indians. Reeves became a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1875 at the age of 38. He was one of the first African Americans to become a deputy U.S. Marshal in the West. He served 32 years as a federal lawman, during which time he arrested 3,000 felons. Later, Reeves obtained land in Van Buren, Arkansas, where he married his wife, Nellie Jenny, and built an 8-room house and raised 10 children. He was the first black settler in the region. Congress authorized the official formation of 6 all-black peacetime military units with the Army Reorganization Act of July 28, 1866. Initially, it created 6 peacetime regiments of exclusively black soldiers. Later, these regiments were melded into 4, 2 infantry and 2 cavalry. Initially, they were led by white officers. Approximately 25,000 men served in the 4 regiments between 1866 and 1917. The first enlisted men in the cavalry and infantry regiments were 18 and 19-year-olds, too young to have seen service in the Civil War. Others were Civil War veterans as well as newly freed slaves who were eager to have an honorable vocation that promised income, food, clothing, and shelter. Some were also runaway slaves who had escaped to Mexico and lived with Native Americans. It is commonly believed that Native Americans, Cheyenne or Comanche, gave the Buffalo Soldiers their nickname, although several different stories exist about what Buffalo Soldier refers to. Some think it was a reference to their hair resembling a buffalo. Others think the term Buffalo Soldiers was a term of respect for the bravery and tenacity of the black soldiers. Henry O. Flipper was the first black man to attend West Point, becoming an officer of the Buffalo Soldiers after graduating in 1877. He had been born into slavery in 1856. He was court-martialed out of the Army due to charges that a military review later concluded were dubious, and had been made because Flipper was black. President Clinton posthumously pardoned Flipper in 1999. John Hanks Alexander was born in 1864 at Helena, Arkansas, to former slaves. He graduated first in his high school class. He attended Oberlin College from 1881 until he passed the entrance exam for West Point in 1883. He was the second African American graduate of the U.S. Military Academy and the first to hold a regular command position in the U.S. Armed Forces. In February 1894, Alexander was appointed professor of military science and tactics at Wilberforce University. Shortly after arriving, he suffered a ruptured aorta and died on March 26, 1894. John Hanks Alexander was buried with military honors in Xenia, Ohio. The most notable Buffalo Soldier was Colonel Charles Young. Charles Young was born in Kentucky during the Civil War to enslaved parents. Shortly after his birth, his father escaped, joined the 5th Regiment, U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery, and arranged for his family to cross the river to Ohio. Young was the first black to graduate from the White High School in Ripley, Ohio. He was the 9th African American man to attend the West Point Military Academy and the 3rd to graduate. In 1894, he took over the position at Wilberforce University after the death of John Hanks Alexander. In 1903, Captain Charles Young would become the first African American National Park Superintendent. Young was assigned as the acting superintendent of Sequoia National Park in California for the summer of 1903 and was regarded as the driving force behind the completion of a much-needed wagon road through Sequoia National Park and the trail to the top of Mount Whitney. The road and trail are still in use today. Black soldiers were not always heroic. Boredom, isolation, and racism inflicted from both officers and civilians resulted in alcoholism, desertion, and suicide. Emanuel Stantz, the first African American to receive the Medal of Honor following the Civil War, was born in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, in 1847. Prior to joining the 9th Cavalry in 1866, Stantz was a farmer, often a euphemism in Army records for former slaves. In May 1870, he led a patrol to find 2 kidnapped children near Fort McKavett, Texas. Stantz and his 9 troopers skirmished with numerous Apaches, captured 15 horses, and protected government supplies without suffering loss. Elated by Stantz's success, his commander immediately recommended him for a Medal of Honor, which Stantz received 1 month later, the first African American regular so honored. This distinction obscures his checkered personal life and military career. Although Stantz eventually held the rank of first sergeant, he was reduced to private 5 times in 21 years of service. He barely avoided discharge many times. His 2 court-martials and various arrests highlighting his alcoholism, abusiveness, and sometimes violent nature. A combination of these factors likely explains his murder on December 25, 1887, after a night of off-post revelry. He was found shot to death near Crawford, Nebraska on Christmas of 1887. Nobody was ever arrested or tried, but many believed he was killed by his own men, who were tired of Stantz's abusive and alcoholic behavior. He is buried in nearby Fort McPherson. The regiments faced extreme and sometimes deadly racism. They were first commanded by whites, and the rank and file often faced extreme racism and prejudice from the Army establishment. Many officers, including George Armstrong Custer, refused to command black regiments, even though it cost them their promotion in rank. Some white officers who commanded them had impressive credentials. Colonel Benjamin Gerson, famous for a 600-mile, 16-day Union cavalry raid through Mississippi in April of 1863, was selected commanding officer of the 10th Cavalry. After George Custer refused the rank of lieutenant colonel with the 9th, Colonel Edward Hatch, a highly decorated Civil War general, was chosen to lead the regiment. The first commanding officer of the 24th Infantry was Lieutenant Colonel William R. Shafter, who would achieve fame in the Spanish-American War. The 25th Infantry was also led by Colonel George L. Andrews. John Joseph Pershing, who in 1917 commanded the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, and Army Sergeant Walter Reed were at times assigned to black units. Pershing had a strong regard for the 10th Cavalry. Pershing's respect for his troops did not endear him to his fellow officers. Black officers faced ostracism from white officers. White officers at Fort Duquesne, Utah, and Fort Robinson, Nebraska, complained, for example, that they were discriminated against by the Army because it assigned the only black line officers, Alexander and Young, to their 9th Cavalry. The War Department responded that the assignments were attributable to existing vacancies. The reaction of the black officers to discrimination varied. Captain Henry Plummer plunged himself deeply into black nationalist activities, culminating in an 1894 proposal to the War Department to lead an expedition of 100 black soldiers into Central Africa to introduce American civilization and Christianity and to colonize part of the African continent for the U.S. before the European nations had completed their division of the continent. Charles Young, on the other hand, devoted much of his energies to pleasing his superiors with his work performance, even as they regularly upgraded him for tactical errors. He rarely concerned himself with his social isolation. All 4 black units remained in the West from 1869 until the Spanish-American War, beginning in 1898. The War Department kept black regiments along the western frontiers because it was feared their presence in eastern states, particularly in the South, would prompt racial violence. However senseless and unreasonable it may be regarded, wrote General C.C. Augur, commander of the Department of the South in 1879, a strong prejudice exists at the South against colored troops. African Americans could only serve west of the Mississippi River because many whites didn't want to see armed black soldiers in or near their communities. Many of the black soldiers were detailed to escort westbound wagon trains filled with settlers. The soldiers helped build forts, railroads, telegraph lines, and roads, and they protected livestock and settlers from the many dangers of the western wilderness. Some black soldiers were highly conscious of their role in the pacification of the West. "We made the West," boasts 10th Cavalry Private Henry McCombs. "We defeated the hostile tribes of Indians and made the country safe to live in." On occasion, however, they guarded Native Americans in Indian Territory from other Indians. Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek farmers from the east suffered as much from Comanche or Kiowa raids as did white farmers in neighboring states, or protected Indian people from the depredations of European Americans, as occurred in 1879 when 10th Cavalry troops defended Kiowa women and children from Texas Rangers who had invaded their village, intent upon killing and scalping its occupants. In 1888, units of the 9th Regiment protected Ute Indians from Colorado militiamen determined to enter their reservation in pursuit of tribal leader Colorado. Protection of the inhabitants of Indian Territory meant repeatedly removing David L. Payne and hundreds of white settlers called boomers, whom he illegally led into Indian Territory between 1879 and his death in 1884. In 1878, the injudicious intervention of Colonel Dudley, the commander at Fort Stanton near Lincoln, resulted in black and white troops supporting the Murphy-Dolan Group, one of two equally violent factions of businessmen ranchers. The Murphy-Dolan faction, headed by Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, and the McSween-Tunstall Group, led by Alexander McSween and John Tunstall, both recruited dozens of cowboy gunmen while appealing for federal assistance to crush their opponents. In 1892, 12 years after the Lincoln County conflict, 9th Cavalry troopers again found themselves enmeshed in a civil dispute between powerful cattlemen and ranch owners in Johnson County, Wyoming Territory. In 1890, small ranchers in Wyoming protested the territory's 1884 law, which allowed the major cattle ranchers to claim all unbranded cattle. Unable to get the law amended in a legislature dominated by powerful cattlemen, the small ranchers resorted to claiming unbranded cattle, prompting the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which represented the large ranchers, to label their opponents rustlers. In 1892, they hired 25 gunmen to drive the small ranchers out of northern Wyoming. Local law enforcement officials, however, supported by the 6th Cavalry, arrested both the cattlemen and their hired guns for the death of two alleged rustlers near Casper. After 1890, black soldiers were far more likely to confront angry white strikers than native warriors. Beginning with the Coeur d'Alene mining district shut down in 1892 through the national rail strike 2 years later, and the second confrontation at Coeur d'Alene district in 1899, African American troops were called upon to defend life and property and to maintain law and order, a curious paradox in light of anti-black violence common in the South during this period. Buffalo soldiers played an important role in the history of our national parks. The African American soldiers of the 24th Infantry and 9th Cavalry were responsible for patrolling the 320-mile route between the Presidio in San Francisco to Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks. Their units built roads and trails along the route, and they protected these new parks from poaching, logging, fire, and trespass grazing. The U.S. Army administered Sequoia and Yosemite National Parks from 1891 to 1914, when it was replaced by civilian management. In the summer of 1903, Charles Young had already faced many challenges. Young and his troops arrived at Sequoia National Park after a 16-day ride from the Presidio of San Francisco to find that one of their major assignments would be the extension of the wagon road. Hoping to break the sluggish pattern of previous military administrations, Young poured his considerable energies into the project. Young and his troops built as much road as the combined results of the 3 previous summers. as well as building a trail to the top of Mount Whitney, the highest point in the contiguous United States. Although Colonel Charles Young only served one season as acting superintendent of the national park, he and his men have not been forgotten. The roads that they built are still in use today, having served millions of park visitors for more than 117 years. The National Park Service has made an effort to chronicle the achievements of these men. In the Presidio of San Francisco, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and the Presidio Trust have developed an education program using the historic stables that the Buffalo Soldiers actually used to house their horses. At Yosemite National Park, a park ranger portrays one of the U.S. Army's Buffalo Soldiers as part of his interpretation of Yosemite's history. Sequoia National Park has a giant sequoia named for Colonel Young, in honor of his lasting legacy in the park. Charles L. Cousins was a porter for the Pullman Company. In those days, that was one of the best jobs for black men. By saving 10% of every dollar he made and teaching himself construction skills, he was able to purchase rundown buildings in the Five Points neighborhood of Denver and repair them with salvaged material. The renovated properties were then rented at modest rates. He became a major landowner in that region of Denver and provided reasonable housing to African Americans and other minorities in that area.